When I first inherited the property, I knew it was valuable, but I had no idea just how audacious the HOA would be. The land stretched over several acres, empty, untamed, a mix of forested patches and open fields. It wasn't zoned for commercial use, but residential construction? That was a gray area, or at least I assumed it was. What I didn't expect was for the HOA to act as if my land was theirs. The first sign came in the form of survey markers. Thin metal stakes dotted the corners of what I knew was my property, and for a moment, I assumed the HOA had hired someone for routine boundary checks. But soon, heavy equipment appeared: bulldozers, graders, and trucks carrying piles of lumber and concrete. My stomach sank. They were building on my land without permission. I reached out immediately. Emails, certified letters, phone calls to board members. I reminded them of the deed, the exact boundaries, and my ownership rights. Each message was met with silence or vague assurances that the construction was permitted and under review. In reality, I realized the HOA had already started construction with no intention of stopping. I had two choices: intervene immediately, risking confrontation, legal wrangling, and halting progress, or let them continue while I prepared for a proper response. I chose the latter. Every beam they raised, every foundation poured, every road graded across my property became a visual record of their overreach. I documented everything: photographs, drone footage, timestamps. Every piece of evidence was logged meticulously. This wasn't just planning ahead. This was strategy. Neighbors started talking. Some were excited about new homes. Some were hesitant. But no one seemed to know whose land it truly was. The HOA acted confidently, moving forward as if my ownership didn't exist. They held meetings, sent brochures, and even invited prospective buyers to walk the lots. It was surreal. My land, my inheritance, being parceled out and sold without my consent. But still I waited, quietly. Construction accelerated. Week by week, the skeletal frames of houses appeared. Streets were graded, utilities laid, and mailboxes installed. 96 homes in total. Each new structure a testament to the HOA's audacity, each nail driven without permission a challenge to my authority. Yet I didn't stop them. I let them finish the work. Patience, I reminded myself, was part of the plan. Reacting too early would have complicated the legal case and possibly given them the appearance of legitimacy. By the time the last house was structurally complete, I had built an unshakable case. Survey documents, photographs, correspondence, all organized and verified. It was clear that the entire development sat squarely on my property. Their claims of easements, rights of access, or presumed authority were flimsy at best and fraudulent at worst. I knew that one decisive action would not only reclaim my land but also establish accountability for the HOA's blatant overreach. And so I prepared. Lawyers were consulted. The court system informed. Evidence reviewed. Strategy perfected. I wasn't moving in anger or seeking revenge. I was asserting ownership, establishing the law, and ensuring that no precedent existed for anyone to assume my property as theirs. When the time came, every home, every street, every completed structure became not just a symbol of audacity, but proof of entitlement misused. The stage was set. The HOA had finished what they started, confident in their assumed control. They believed that construction equaled ownership. They believed that 96 homes built meant 96 stakes in their favor. But the reality was different. Everything they had built was on my land. And the court, when it saw the evidence, would see the same truth. One document, one signature, one legal precedent would undo months of arrogance and overreach. And when that day arrived, it would not just be a victory for me. It would be a warning to anyone who assumed authority without verification, and a lesson in patience, precision, and the power of the law. After the last roof was installed and the streets were paved, the HOA felt victorious. They were moving into a fully built development, ready to sell homes and collect dues, completely unaware that every inch of that land belonged to me. Their confidence was palpable. Emails circulated boasting about completion milestones and upcoming buyer tours. Board meetings were filled with self-congratulations and strategic discussions about marketing and amenities. In their minds, construction equaled legitimacy. The deed, the surveys, the legal ownership, irrelevant details. I, on the other hand, remained patient. I had watched them pour months of work, money, and energy into structures they assumed they controlled. Every photograph I took of foundation lines, every drone sweep showing plot boundaries, every time-stamped email documenting their communications, all became critical pieces of my case. The irony wasn't lost on me. The more they built, the more undeniable the evidence became. They were constructing not only homes, but the proof of their own overreach. During this period, neighbors and even some board members started noticing discrepancies. One construction foreman casually mentioned to a neighbor that some of the property markers looked different from the HOA's plans. Another resident jokingly asked if the HOA had official permission to build on what might not be theirs. I didn't intervene in these conversations. I let uncertainty grow naturally. Every doubt planted would later reinforce the credibility of my legal claim. Meanwhile, the HOA's internal communications grew increasingly confident but internally contradictory. Some emails referenced permits and easements that were never approved. Others assumed common understanding would suffice to justify their actions. The arrogance in those messages was almost theatrical. They truly believed that once 96 homes stood completed, ownership would bend to their narrative. The problem for them was that construction cannot override property law, and I had all the documentation to prove it. I made one careful decision at this stage. I would not contact them directly. No letters, no warnings, no confrontations. Any premature move could give them the appearance of legitimacy or allow them to claim harassment. I had to wait until every nail, every shingle, every road, every utility line was firmly in place. Let them finish their illusion of control completely. The court would later see the irony and gravity of their audacity. 96 homes, built illegally on land they assumed was theirs. During these weeks, my legal team prepared meticulously. Survey lines were verified by independent professionals. Historical ownership records were compiled, dating back decades, showing clear title. Every HOA communication, every email and board minute that mentioned the land, every instance of their assumptions or claims of authority was cataloged. The more confident the HOA became, the easier it was to connect the dots. The evidence wasn't just compelling, it was overwhelming. Finally, the groundwork was complete. I had let the HOA finish their work, confident that the court would see both the scale of their overreach and the clarity of ownership. When the filing went in, it wasn't just a legal action. It was the culmination of months of observation, documentation, and patience. 96 homes, every street, every driveway, every structure became evidence. The HOA had built their own undoing. And when the summons arrived at the board's office, panic quietly replaced confidence. The air shifted. Emails stopped circulating with bold claims. Board members whispered in corners, unsure how to respond. The very authority they assumed during construction evaporated instantly, replaced by the realization that they were in court over land they didn't own. For months, they had thought victory was theirs. Now, the truth was unavoidable. When the court summons landed on the HOA president's desk, it was like a sudden thunderclap in a calm sky. Their confidence evaporated instantly. Meetings that had once been filled with swagger and strategic bravado now descended into whispered panic. Board members who had once celebrated the completion of 96 homes were suddenly questioning every decision. Emails stopped mid-sentence. Phone calls went unanswered. The illusion of control that had carried them through months of construction was gone, replaced by uncertainty and fear. They called a special board meeting immediately, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. In that small conference room, tension was palpable. The president paced nervously, leafing through permits she had never properly verified. One member admitted, reluctantly, that no easement, permit, or signed agreement existed giving them authority over the land. Another whispered that they might have to halt sales, but fear of buyers pulling out only intensified the anxiety. The HOA had assumed that construction itself created legitimacy, but legality doesn't bend to confidence. Meanwhile, my legal team had already prepared for the first hearing. Every foundation, every street, every driveway was mapped, measured, and documented with photos, survey markers, and timestamps. The correspondence with the HOA, the emails, letters, and board minutes that showed their assumption of authority, was meticulously catalogued. They hadn't just overstepped, they had overbuilt, and every inch of the development now worked against them. When the first hearing arrived, the courtroom was a mixture of tension and quiet astonishment. The HOA's lawyer presented what they believed were claims of customary use and implied easements. They argued that the community had relied on the land for planned development and that undoing it now would harm homeowners who had made plans based on those assumptions. But the judge, reviewing the deeds and surveys, saw through it immediately. Ownership was clear. Authority had never transferred. Construction, no matter how complete, did not grant the HOA rights that the law never gave them. As evidence was presented, the mood in the courtroom shifted further. The photographs of the completed homes, streets, and utilities, once a symbol of HOA confidence, now became proof of audacity and negligence. The court could see that the HOA had acted on assumption, disregarding legal ownership entirely. Board minutes and emails, which had previously circulated internally as tokens of strategy, now read like a record of recklessness. Each message, each meeting note, each internal boast worked against them. Even residents watching the case unfold were stunned. Many had assumed the HOA had rights because they saw construction happening month after month. Now they realized that their board had misrepresented authority and that the homes they had admired were sitting on land that legally did not belong to the HOA. Questions that had been ignored for months were suddenly answered in stark clarity. Ownership is not determined by action or intention, but by legal documentation. By the end of the hearing, it was clear which way the wind blew. The HOA tried to salvage credibility by emphasizing intent and prior communication, but intent is no substitute for law. The court acknowledged that while stopping construction midway could have been chaotic, the fact remained: 96 homes, built without proper authority, could not override ownership rights. The implications for the HOA were immediate. They were facing not just the loss of authority over the land, but potential liability for encouraging trespass and construction on property that was not theirs. For me, watching it unfold in the courtroom was almost surreal. Months of patient observation, documentation, and strategic restraint had turned what seemed like a nightmare, an HOA building an entire neighborhood on my inheritance, into undeniable proof of their overreach. Every confident step they had taken during construction became evidence. Every assumption, every ignored deed, every skipped verification now reinforced my case. By the time the judge adjourned, the HOA knew the game had changed completely. The narrative of control, once so firmly in their hands, had evaporated. And for the first time, they understood that patience, preparation, and clear ownership could not only protect property, they could undo an entire construction project built on arrogance. After the hearing, the HOA scrambled to regroup. Their board meetings became defensive, reactive, almost desperate. The arrogance that had driven them to build 96 homes on my land had dissolved into an anxious awareness that their authority was now under scrutiny, not just by me, but by the law itself. Every decision, every email, every statement was measured against the facts they had long ignored: the deeds, the surveys, and the clear property boundaries. They tried a few last-minute maneuvers. One member suggested claiming community benefit as justification for the construction. Another proposed a delayed acknowledgement of ownership, hoping that acknowledging a minor error would save face. But each suggestion was quickly shut down, either by legal counsel or by the obvious truth: no amount of spin could override the law. For once, authority without legal standing was meaningless. I stayed silent through their chaos. No calls, no emails, no public announcements. My role was simple: let the evidence speak. Every house, every road, every utility line became a testament to their overreach. The more frantic their internal discussions, the stronger my position became. Patience, documentation, and legal clarity had replaced confrontation. And it worked. When the final mediation session was scheduled, the HOA's tone was cautious. They had no choice. The mediator laid out the situation plainly. The land was mine. Every inch of the 96-home development rested on my property. Any continued claims or misrepresentations could expose the board to personal liability. The HOA had assumed authority that the law never granted, and every misstep was now recorded on the public record. The discussion was tense but brief. Board members nodded quietly as terms were outlined. They had to formally recognize my ownership, correct any prior communications sent to residents, and acknowledge that all future planning related to the land required my consent. Any interference with the property would be considered trespassing. It wasn't a negotiation. It was enforcement of fact and law. Letters were sent to all residents, clarifying the situation. The HOA attempted to frame the message as updates rather than admissions, but the intent was clear. They no longer had authority over the land. Residents who had once assumed ownership rights were now informed of the reality. Some were embarrassed. Others were quietly relieved to understand the truth. No one disputed it publicly. I made additional preparations to secure my property physically and legally. Survey markers were reinforced. Boundaries clearly defined. Signage installed. Not for intimidation, but for clarity. The HOA had learned its lesson. Assumption and audacity cannot substitute for legal authority. By the end of this process, the entire development existed under a new paradigm. I had control over access, maintenance, and future use. The HOA retained no rights over the structures they had built, nor could they interfere with my property in any legal sense. 96 homes, the streets, and utilities, they were still there, but their presence no longer implied control. For the HOA, the lesson was bitter and permanent. Authority is not granted by volume, visibility, or activity. It is granted by law. Every member who had pushed for construction without verification had learned, firsthand, that power is fragile when it is not backed by legal fact. As I walked the property that evening, the sun setting over the completed neighborhood, it was quiet. The homes, the streets, the trees, all stood undisturbed. What had once been a source of potential conflict now existed as evidence of patience, preparation, and legal principle. The HOA had built on my land, but the law had ultimately restored the balance. The ordeal reinforced a simple truth. Patience and documentation always outmatch arrogance and assumption. By letting them finish, I had turned their own overreach into the strongest evidence for my victory. And in doing so, I ensured that their audacity could never again go unchallenged. After the court and mediation finalized, the property finally felt like mine again. The 96 homes still stood, complete, silent witnesses to the audacity of the HOA. But their presence no longer carried authority. The streets, the driveways, the utilities, all the infrastructure they had built, now rested under my ownership. The irony was almost poetic. Months of their confidence, labor, and assumption now became proof of overreach, and each structure testified to the law's supremacy over hubris. Residents quickly adjusted. Some expressed embarrassment over their assumptions, realizing that they had celebrated development that was never rightfully the HOA's to authorize. Others were curious but respectful, asking questions about property boundaries and access. I answered each one patiently, showing them deeds and survey lines where necessary. Clear communication replaced assumption. Education replaced conflict. The HOA had once relied on confusion and unverified claims to assert control, but clarity now defined the neighborhood. The HOA itself became quieter than ever. Board members who had once marched confidently onto my land now avoided direct confrontation. Any communication with me was careful, cautious, and documented. Their previous posture of dominance had evaporated completely. They no longer issued threats, spread misleading notices, or encouraged residents to trespass. Their previous arrogance had been replaced with a subtle but unmistakable caution, an acknowledgement that their authority had limits, and those limits were legally enforced. I also took measures to protect the property going forward. Survey markers were reinforced along every boundary. Signs clearly indicated ownership and access restrictions. While I never intended to intimidate anyone, I understood that clarity is a preventive measure. The law had worked on my side, but prevention ensures that history does not repeat itself. Each street, each home, each tree became part of a living map of legal reality, not HOA assumption. Walking through the property in the evenings became a kind of quiet reflection. The homes were impressive in scale, but they were also reminders of patience and planning. By letting the HOA finish, I had turned their entire overreach into a documented case of evidence. Every corner, every frame, every completed structure now reinforced the truth of ownership. It was a victory won not by confrontation, but by strategy, foresight, and the power of documentation. Over time, I noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. HOA meetings were shorter, more fact-based, less assumption-driven. Residents began asking for documentation, checking boundaries, and confirming authority before acting. The lesson extended beyond my property. It had ripple effects, encouraging respect for legal ownership and discouraging presumptive actions. The audacity of 96 homes built without permission became a cautionary tale. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I realized the story wasn't just about property rights or HOA drama. It was about patience, foresight, and respecting the law. Authority that is assumed without verification is fragile. Confidence without legitimacy is fleeting. By letting them complete their work, documenting every step and presenting clear, undeniable evidence in court, I didn't just reclaim my property, I redefined the balance of power. The HOA learned that boundaries are not suggestions, and legal ownership is absolute. Today, the property exists as it always should have. Residents respect the boundaries. The homes remain completed and functional, but they no longer symbolize entitlement. They symbolize a lesson learned. And I am left with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that patience, preparation, and legal clarity turned an audacious overreach into an unassailable victory. The HOA built on my land, yes, but in the end, it was their own construction that solidified my claim and ensured that the law prevailed. Ownership, it turns out, is more than possession. It is responsibility, patience, and the courage to enforce what is rightfully yours. And when those principles are followed, even 96 homes built without permission cannot stand against the truth.